So thank you for coming into the studio with us today. I'm here with Anton Chaikin of Executive Intelligence Review, who has done extensive research over the years on the build-up toward the Kennedy assassination and the networks that were involved in that, and really the larger significance for the post-World War II shift that occurred from this transition of the United States run by the Franklin Roosevelt administration to the forces that controlled the Truman administration. And we're inviting Tony here to crap, I said Tony. I'll start over.
Doesn't matter.
Okay. So, thank you for coming to the studio today. I'm here with Anton Chaikin, and we've invited him in to elaborate on the continuing discussion of the John F. Kennedy assassination, and posted here on this page on the Kennedy legacy 50 years, both on economics and the larger strategic and international importance of what he represented and what the apparatus was that opposed him. And we want to ask Anton here today to go through some of his research that he's done over many years on the international apparatus that took over after Franklin Roosevelt, and how this typifies more generally the struggle in American history of the opposing forces that have sought to control the United States. And first of all, I just want to ask you about this grouping, the international apparatus, really how the Truman administration shifted the policies of Franklin Roosevelt and what that meant for the world. And we'll get into the significance of that, of the Kennedy assassination.
In 1945, when Roosevelt died, Winston Churchill was also kicked out of the government in England. He wasn't even the prime minister anymore. But he represented the royal family and the oligarchy in the empire. And he, with his followers inside the United States, certain disloyal factions in Wall Street and Washington, changed the government of the United States. They made an alliance with the connivance of the Truman administration that eliminated American sovereignty in all but name. It merged, in effect, the security services and intelligence services of the two countries, United Kingdom and the United States, and set the resources of the United States of America into a subordinate position to this alliance, whose purposes were at odds with America's Constitution and America's historical role in the world. This was done on the pretext of stopping potential communist aggression in Europe or elsewhere. And it began an era of instability and war that has continued to the present day, interrupted only by John F. Kennedy's presidency. This change involved a clique within the United States. Among the personalities who were leaders of that Churchill coup inside America were the brothers John Foster and Allen Dulles, who had been lawyers for the cartels set up by the British and Nazi Germany and Wall Street during the 1930s. They were members of a firm, Sullivan and Cromwell, that represented Wall Street bankers, and that in the period of the early 20th century used the power of the United States against the historic principles of the country and against the Constitution to control the resources of countries such as Latin America. A mirror image of the British Empire.
Now, John Foster Dulles was Secretary of State under Eisenhower, and then Allen Dulles was the head of the CIA under Eisenhower, and apparently their father was the Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson, too. And
no, that was their uncle. That was Lansing, their uncle.
You were talking
Robert
about the
Lansing.
Truman administration already, so
right.
Were they already ingrained in some...
Yes. Allen Dulles, following his work with the Harriman Bush Bank in the 1930s, where Allen, along with his brother, were lawyers for their holdings of Nazi enterprises in Germany and Poland. Towards the end of the war, Allen Dulles was one of the leaders of U.S. intelligence whose purposes were entirely disloyal to Roosevelt and to the war effort. And at that time, Allen and his brother were both opposed to Roosevelt politically. They worked in the 44 elections to try to throw him out. Allen Dulles set up arrangements before the end of the war to get German Nazis that were useful and would be useful again in a post-Hitler era to work for the British and Allied cause in Europe as leaders of terrorism and leaders of subversion. Allen Dulles, in that role, was hired by President Truman under British influence to be the director of plans for the new Central Intelligence Agency that was set up under Truman. His brother, John Foster Dulles, a notorious right-wing Republican, was brought in as an advisor to the State Department by Truman. So the idea of Roosevelt's Democratic Party was obliterated. And the reality was this alliance that was formalized in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, set up in the late 1940s. This alliance created a set of secret armies inside Europe and really elsewhere, but the ones in Europe came to be known as Gladio, Italian for sword. It was set up in France, in Italy, in Scandinavia, inside Germany. And it was modeled, the secret armies were modeled on the Special Operations Executive, SOE, run by Churchill during World War II, British intelligence, for subversion and sabotage and guerrilla war. And then at the end of World War II, the pattern from the SOE was implemented under the training of the Special Air Services of the British military and intelligence system. So they were training cadres inside Europe. The cadres consisted of a range of groups and individuals who could operate in secret with secret military stores and under the discipline of the NATO clandestine arrangements. Among the most important cadres throughout Europe were German Nazis that had been brought out of Germany by the Anglo-American, that is the Anglo-Dulles services. One of the leaders of that side of it was Gehlen, G-E-H-L-E-N, who was the official head of the West German intelligence services in the post-war period, and he had been one of Hitler's intelligence leaders. Otto Skorzeny, the leader of commandos, and a notorious war criminal, torturer of Americans, escaped with the help of the NATO people from custody in Germany, and then was simply let to roam about Europe and establish his base in Spain. He played a big role in the Gladio left behind armies. The basis for getting acceptance by governments in Western Europe for this structure was that they would need to have people who would stay there undercover if the Russians invaded Western Europe. So that's the rubric left behind.
Can you say what these organizations were trying to do? What was their aim? What was their overall intention? You mentioned the Special Operations Executive, which was sort of the intelligence apparatus of the British military. Was that right? And then during World War II,
during World War II,
then you also mentioned this
the Special Operations Executive
and what Permindex. What were they? If you hadn't mentioned it already, but it's related. What was their intention?
In Western Europe, in France, in Italy, they had a dual function. As I mentioned, they were supposed to be ready to carry out sabotage against Russians that might invade Europe from the east. But the other function, which of course is more important because the Russians never did invade Western Europe, was to guard Europe against the possibility that governments in Europe and nations in Europe would try to assert their sovereignty and their purposes, as America had done when we had a revolution, against this imperial alliance that was put over them top down. And they could say that somebody was threatening to go red or was a danger to the community. And this was used as a pretext to rile up people against Charles de Gaulle, who eventually kicked this whole apparatus out of France. But
can you say more about that?
In the 1950s, the winds of change were in the air and throughout the colonial world, in the Arab world, in Africa and Asia, that the colonial countries were determined to get free of British and French, Dutch empires, and the British Empire wanted to continue this regardless of nominal independence, complete control. And there arose a struggle that became fiercer and fiercer with the overthrow of governments in various countries by this secret apparatus of NATO, the combination of the British intelligence services and the dullest crowd controlling American services. There was an overthrow of the government in Guatemala, a democratic government, the overthrow of the democratic government in Iran, nominally to keep the British oil interests in control in Iran. There was a war going on against, as everybody knows, against the Indo-Chinese, the Vietnamese, to keep the French Empire, a war against the Arabs in North Africa. The military involved and the secret services involved were an extension of this NATO apparatus. Not for U.S. purposes, never for U.S. purposes, and never actually fighting against communism. The only instance where there was a direct war against communism was at the beginning of the Kennedy administration, when this far-flung apparatus of the British and the disloyal American controllers of intelligence, such as the Dulles Gang, got up this ragtag band of Cuban exiles, 1,400 people, to invade Cuba. And that was done not to overthrow Castro, but to embarrass and try to destroy Kennedy at the outset of his administration. So in France, this whole thing blew up in 1958-59 when Charles de Gaulle came back in as president, got a new constitution, set up the Fifth Republic, and said, I'm going to stop this war in Algeria against the Arabs there. The NATO secret army left behind structure, spun off a group called the Secret Army Organization, OAS in French. It was headquartered in Algeria and Spain. And the dual geographical location was based on the fact that in Spain, which is part of NATO, you still had a fascist government left over from World War II under Franco. And Spain was the base for various Nazis and neo-fascists. One of the most flamboyant was Otto Skorzeny, who had been brought out of Germany by Dulles. And certain French generals who were in this NATO apparatus and politicians led by Jacques Soustelle and Georges Bidault allied themselves to the Nazi and fascist apparatus inside Spain and created a violent, constantly hitting assassination bureau that worked in France, in Italy, in North Africa, and elsewhere. This apparatus brought into it people such as Clay Shaw, who was an American intelligence spook, a sadomasochist, very strange fellow, who had been he's from New Orleans, and he, in World War II, he was part of the OSS as a liaison into the office of Winston Churchill. He was a fanatic pro-imperial, pro-British guy. And so in the 1950s, Clay Shaw, by then a wealthy CIA contract person under the Dulles machine, set up with others in the old British apparatus, the old Churchill apparatus, such as a guy up in Canada, Lewis Mortimer Bloomfield. They set up an organization called Permindex. The president of it was Ferenc Nagy, Nagy, who had been former prime minister of Hungary and who left there when the Russians took over Hungary. He was working with Dulles in the United States now and working with various kinds of right-wing circles in Europe. So they included in their Permindex directorate those who could be trusted to be totally opposed to American purposes, to historical American purposes, and serve this alliance secret army apparatus. The Permindex organization as such was based in Rome and Switzerland, and a cognate group in New Orleans.
So you said that in New Orleans, Clay Shaw is there, and he was part of the Special Operations Executive during World War II, or you said that he was
No.
stationed?
He was actually,
at Churchill.
yeah, he was in England with in the Churchill office.
And then Mortimer Bloomfield.
Mortimer Bloomfield was the head of the
special
was an executive of the Special Operations Executive, British intelligence, the military and intelligence underground. In Canada, he was connected to the right wing in Israel and to the American Secret Services as the head of contract operations for the counterintelligence division of the FBI, working with J. Edgar Hoover. And this is a foreigner. This is a Canadian who's working for the British Crown. So he's the personnel manager, in effect, for counterintelligence for our FBI. So this whole apparatus is essentially a foreign apparatus that is using the resources and energies of the United States, just as Wall Street has used the credit and the power of the United States for purposes foreign to this country.
So let's bring this back for people. The question around de Gaulle kicking this, you said NATO and Permindex organization out of France. Why did this occur? And what was going on?
All right, so the war was going on in Algeria in the late 1950s. John Kennedy here said we've got to get out. As a senator, he condemned that the U.S. would be allying itself to these empires and fighting against the aspirations of the Arabs and Africans. The people controlling the French settlers in Africa, in Algeria, and the French army in Algeria, a disloyal section of that army, fought against Charles de Gaulle's decision, President de Gaulle's decision to end the war and give independence to the Arabs. And they tried to stage a coup against Charles de Gaulle. They made repeated assassination attempts based on this secret army apparatus, their official, what they called the OAS, and the gang structure they had with the Nazis and with fascists in Spain and so forth. After this, one of the really flagrant assassination attempts where 100 machine gun bullets hit the car of de Gaulle, and he survived. De Gaulle carried out an investigation of this apparatus. He found this Permindex organization that had been financing the assassination attempts along with other finances that I've mentioned. And he forced the Permindex he asked the Swiss to kick it out of Switzerland, and it was kicked out of Italy. They did successfully murder the oil minister, the head of the state oil company in Italy, Mattei, but unsuccessful in the attempt to kill de Gaulle. It was after this.
You're saying Permindex?
Permindex
carried out the assassination.
No, not Permindex, but the grouping of the secret armies that they were financing.
Okay, the OAS.
Yeah, did kill Mattei in Spain, in Italy. So this also led to John Kennedy as president taking the side of de Gaulle, giving him our support, and Kennedy removing Allen Dulles from his post as director of the Central Intelligence Agency, along with his two top deputies, in 1961. Kennedy continued to work with the Arabs, with, for example, the Nasser, the president of Egypt, who was backing the Algerian Revolution, and attempted to stabilize the Middle East and that entire region by getting development started. So this apparatus had, the enemy killer apparatus had what Lyndon Johnson later called a whole murder incorporated operating in the Caribbean and elsewhere, the carrying out murders in other parts of the world. And it was Clay Shaw, the director of Permindex, one of the directors, from New Orleans, who was the only individual prosecuted for the murder of John F. Kennedy. He was part of a group in New Orleans, along with David Ferry and Guy Bannister, who was in FBI counterintelligence. They were involved with Cuban exiles with huge stores of ammunitions that were coming in through French companies, particularly Schlumberger. And they ran, as the DA in New Orleans discovered, they ran a false flag operation that brought in this patsy, this stooge, Lee Harvey Oswald, where he would be distributing pro-communist leaflets from the same address as an anti-communist, heavy right-wing organization was operating, Guy Bannister's office. You have the photograph of the poor Oswald distributing leaflets outside the Trade Mart run by Clay Shaw. So this whole apparatus is like, it was described by Garrison as a circus of deviates and criminals and international operatives who were part of hit squads operating in New Orleans that was involved with setting up the assassination of Kennedy, probably with personnel that came in from Europe, from this base in Spain of the secret army apparatus to kill our president. And the problem with looking at the 50th anniversary of John Kennedy's assassination is to see this as a coup d'etat, finishing the coup d'etat that was begun at the end of Roosevelt's administration, a coup d'etat against our government and against our Constitution, from which we have not recovered. But the anger that people should feel towards this should be magnified by the fact that submitting to it is not any longer a possibility, because it's going to kill us. Because this apparatus, this alliance of the United States with the Royal Imperial British Empire, this dead empire that rules the world by money and outdated ideas of the subordination of most of mankind to these lunatic financiers. This has caused such increasing chaos and such a potential for extermination of the whole planet that we have to use this image of Kennedy's success in developing civilization and furthering America's cause as an image to get us back going in that direction again to save ourselves.
All right, well, I think this has really been a very useful discussion today. I'd like to thank you for coming into the studio.
You want to do? Do you want to do the?
Set off. I was gonna.
I'm sorry. Okay, you can edit it, right?
We have to edit it.
Yeah.
I thought that was a good point to end. You want to keep going?
Well,
I will have to put some image up or something.
I'm sorry.
But it doesn't matter. Do you want to keep going?
Well, I was thinking about doing the other.
I know you want to do the 19th century, but that seemed to be a good point you brought it back to. I can. You want me to ask you about that?
Yeah. Let's see.
All right.
Sorry.
Yeah, it seems to me with the amount of coups that you just described that were going on internationally, conducted by the Dulles brothers, and as you mentioned, there's Permandex, the OAS, how many people that they had overthrown, to say that when our own president was assassinated, that it wasn't a coup, is equivalent to saying that you had just misplaced your furniture when everybody else in the preceding weeks in your neighborhood had been provably robbed. But I want to ask you about the precedent of this. You look at what ends up happening with Kennedy. What's the precedence for this kind of coup against an American president in U.S. history? Because you've also done an extensive amount of research in that area.
Yeah, we had previously 3 presidents who were shot to death: Lincoln, Garfield, and McKinley. And in each case, these presidents were in a strategic war for the American as against the British system for the world. They had they had reached turning points in our history that the enemy side saw as requiring them to risk a great deal to try to destroy America's initiatives at these points. Just to give an idea of what's the British system. The British Empire is developing its power against the ability of each country that it took over to take a place in civilization, or to tear down what was already there as a civilized force. Notoriously, this was the way they treated Ireland and India and later Africa. It's equivalent to a pirate in a neighborhood who would say to the people under his dominion, "You have to keep your doors unlocked. I call this free trade. And if you keep your doors unlocked, I will consider you to be friendly. Otherwise, I'm suspicious of you. You're not with the system." Whereas the Americans said, "We will help you to lock your doors and to make your house stronger. And then let's be friends." The British never had friends in other countries, the empire. This is essentially the two systems. When clever people in England, who were largely Republicans, invented the machines that led to the Industrial Revolution, the East India faction took over, set up a low-wage factory system, and forbid the export of technology from England. It was a crime to take any machine plans out of the country. And then their world system is based on tearing down or preventing factories from being built in India, in Ireland, and other countries, and taking raw materials out of those countries. They were the boss. Whereas the Americans, after our revolution, developed technology that was increasingly shared with the rest of the world. We developed railroads here. We sent Friedrich List to Germany, and he spread railroads in Germany to truly unite countries inside the country's borders and also across borders, but not having to go through the sea where the British controlled the sea lanes. So this is to strengthen nations. Later, we spread electricity throughout Europe and other parts of the world, and we spread this system of national sovereignty. So Lincoln, as president, was he inherited a dying, depressed country under the control of the British system that with the export of king cotton to England. And he turned this into an era of strong national sovereignty with the greatest army in the world, peace for 40 years, international peace, and heavy industry in the United States and skilled labor, making the United States the determining issue in the world, our system, and it spread to Germany and Russia and Japan to modernize them, that each country should have its own power and be our friends. So he was assassinated by a group set up by John Wilkes Booth, who went to Canada, met with British and Confederate Secret Service people. He put funds into the Montreal Bank that was used by the Confederate Secret Service. He came back to the United States and assassinated Lincoln with a group of Kabbalists. The head of the Confederate Secret Service, Judah Benjamin, went to England and became a Queen's Counsel after this, and was lauded and celebrated by the whole royal circles there for his role against the United States.
Was he originally a British subject?
He was born in the Caribbean. He was a British subject originally, yeah. In the period, in the 20 years into the 1880s, we developed this powerful steel industry and modern farming and a massive apparatus for progress, private property and everything that didn't exist in Europe for the average worker. You know, people had their own houses, things like this, an educated workforce. Garfield came in as president he was elected in 1880, appointed James Blaine Secretary of State, and his regime, his administration, immediately went into a war against Wall Street. He forced the resignation from the Senate of Wall Street's main representative in the Congress, Roscoe Conkling. He upheld the right of Irish underground people to test a new submarine in New York Harbor. It was protested by the British consul. He sent people and aid to Peru to back up their plans to industrialize and build railroads all over South America, and to stop a British-run invasion from Chile. So he was assassinated within months of taking office. The guy who shot him said, "I am a stalwart," meaning the faction of Roscoe Conkling on Wall Street, and Arthur is now president, the vice president who is part of the Wall Street faction. Garfield also set in motion with Blaine a plan to build railroads all over the Americas with South America, to build them up into modern countries as brother countries to us. McKinley took that plan and his notorious hatred for the British system. McKinley, as president, elected in the late 1890s, said, "Who wants free trade? The English want free trade for their benefit, for the benefit of their rich people, and for their social system, which is different from ours." So he's the most notoriously, openly anti-British president that we had. He was murdered as soon as Teddy Roosevelt came in on the ticket for McKinley's second term to make Teddy Roosevelt the president in 1901. Theodore Roosevelt's family were Confederate Secret Service leaders and bankers associated with the Baring Bank of England. And he was a fanatical, racist imperialist in favor of the combined rule of the Anglo-Saxons over humanity. And he worked with Edward VII, King of England, in trying to create blocks of nations, to divide up Europe into blocks so that there would be a great war, which he advocated, along with the King of England.
This was a project of Teddy Roosevelt.
Teddy Roosevelt was active with the King, especially in 1907 and 1906 and 7 in conferences and in various kinds of intrigues.
Or leading up to World War
And
I,
this
which had been planned.
That's right. This was the plan of Edward VII. He died in 1910, but Teddy Roosevelt kept going, and it was in this era that Wall Street came to dominate American finances, and to set up these kinds of British echoing controls over the lives of people in Latin America. The Sullivan and Cromwell firm, the law firm of the Dulles brothers, was set up in this era, and it was in control of and a representative of sugar and banana interests in Latin America, and worked in coordination with the British secret services and British diplomacy throughout the world. So these are the three assassinations. If you take this now forward to Kennedy and look at the outlook of Kennedy compared to this American legacy, Kennedy, like with the early railroads and early ideas of building up powerful modern industry, Kennedy extended to the underdeveloped countries the use of nuclear technology, which was just then being developed. It was in its infancy. It had been obviously started under Franklin Roosevelt. The bomb was dropped by Truman. But Kennedy sought to get the world, and especially the poor countries, on the basis of rapid development with nuclear science, and to get away from the use and deployment of nuclear weapons. And he tried, for example, in Israel to get them to stop developing nuclear weapons, a project that had been started by the Anglo-French alliance, and Soustelle personally had been involved in that. So Kennedy continued this image of America as opening up the world to industrial and scientific progress by trying to help each country to close their doors to looting, to close their doors to intrigues, but to open themselves up to ideas and progress with America as a friend.
So if you look at the period after McKinley's assassination, those decades, there was a real erosion of sovereignty of the United States. The power shift occurred where we turned more power over to Wall Street, and a real collapse of the physical economy, the industrial capacity leading up to Roosevelt. Similarly, after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, we've seen now, of course, in the last decades, the submission of that, and again, an erosion of all national sovereignty on economic policy. Completely, we've laid waste to our economy, and now we're gutted out entirely. Also, the entire transatlantic system. People know what's going on with the collapse in Europe, and here, under the Obama administration, it's kind of the cherry on the top of the destruction of the United States. So, what I'd like to just ask you in closing is, given this, what you've gone through, this understanding of history and the networks behind the Kennedy assassination, and what the precedent for this is, and really this longer-standing struggle, how do we use this knowledge now today to regain the sovereignty of the United States and kick these bums out of the White House that are controlling Obama himself, but really this more, not just this administration or even the Bushes, but this trend since Kennedy's assassination? How do we use this knowledge to reverse that and regain U.S. sovereignty?
I think that it rests on two principles. The first principle is who's going to control the country. A constitutional government and self-government for the benefit and interests of the people, or a group of lunatics who are criminal and have had a criminal empire for centuries, located in Wall Street. They're an adjunct to that alliance and that empire. They're illegitimate. They have never served a constructive purpose in American history. They never built any industries. They only served to loot and destabilize the country. Throughout the time when they first were set up by various intriguers such as Aaron Burr and August Belmont, representing foreign interests, representing the British Empire. So the first principle is get rid of Wall Street. The time has come for us to close Wall Street as an enemy operation inside of our country, and to look at the methods by which Kennedy and other presidents built up industry, technology, lawful enterprises, private enterprises, and infrastructure of the country all at once. How do we achieve higher wages? Bringing up the minimum wage, bringing up the bottom, getting people who had been in slavery, who went to Detroit and got jobs in the steel mills. How did this occur? How could we pay people higher wages than in other countries, than in the British system? By investing long-term in the development of infrastructure and industry and science, as Kennedy did so successfully. So the first principle is get rid of Wall Street. The time has come where that's a matter of life or death. And the second principle is, what was Kennedy's overriding objective, in a sense his emergency objective in his presidency? And that was to achieve a stand down from the Cold War and from the permanent war situation that he'd been handed by the coup after Roosevelt, by the British and their traitorous allies here, to say to the Russians, we recognize your interests as a nation. We don't recognize communism as being useful or legitimate to be spread to some other country. But the national interests of Russia, the national interests of China, the national interests of all of the neutral countries in Africa and elsewhere have to be respected. And we have to have the mutual respect of countries that have a common objective, which is preventing a catastrophic war and giving the nations the ability to survive and to have a growing population to be supported by modern science. That objective, based on the cooperation of the leading powers of the world, is an emergency objective again. We're very close, despite any recent, pulling back from war in Syria or something. We're very close all the time to thermonuclear war. And we have to get back to this point of view that recognizes the common national interests of all of the nations of the world, if they are treated as nations and not subordinated to this insane alliance, this Atlantic alliance of the British royal family and the City of London. So those two principles will save us if we pursue them now on this anniversary of Kennedy's death. And I'll close with this. On Kennedy's death date, November 22nd, in 1990, the European Parliament issued a resolution attacking the existence of the stay-behind armies, Gladio as it was known, and calling for their being taken down, that this was a secret apparatus set up by the NATO structure and the secret services of several countries, anti-democratic, outside of the control of national governments and of the highest leaders of the nations, and that this, with secret stashes of arms, that this represents a danger to the community and it has to be taken down. That's the apparatus that killed Kennedy. That's the apparatus that threatens us today and threatens all of our lives, and it has to be taken down now.